Welcome back to the podcast history of our world. Chapter 49, the Indus Valley Civilization. 200 million years ago, the Indian plate broke off of Africa's southeast coast and made a furious dash for Asia, hurtling north at a breathtaking speed of about 10 centimeters a year. Recent research out of MIT suggests that contact with the Eurasian continent was made as early as 40 million years ago, and India hasn't stopped moving since. Now, in your typical subduction route, one plate is forced under the other, but not quite here. The collision of the Indian and Eurasian plates, with their similar rock densities, forced the two upwards, creating the mighty Himalayas, still growing at a rate of about a centimeter a year. And because these mountains are so immense, they block the weather from northern Asia from coming south. Conversely, they also trap the southern weather from going north. So India ends up having 3 seasons, hot and dry, summer monsoons, and then a sort of in-between. It's considered winter, but I don't consider weather in the 50s to be winter. So why even talk about the weather? Because just like Egypt's history is intertwined with the Nile, India and South Asia in general are intertwined with the cycle of monsoons. The weather is predictable and creates some of the most fertile land in the world. And that's what the first people into South Asia realized, although who were the first is open to debate. The earliest evidence of our hominid ancestors is dated from sometime between 500,000 and 200,000 years ago. Then the first Neolithic peoples appear at places like the Bhimbetka rock shelters at around 9000 BC, and at the settlement of Megar in 7000 BC. And our featured people this episode show up at around 3000 BC, but facts are stubborn things. Let me give you the straight scoop. See, back before there were any people anywhere, there lived a fellow by the name of Manu. Don't worry about how he got here. Anyway, Manu was washing his hands in a river when a little fish swam up to him, begging to be saved from the larger fish in the sea. Manu, realizing that one should always listen to talking fish, agrees and raises the fish in various jars and large pools and such until it's grown into the biggest in the sea. Now the fish decides it's time to repay the kindness by revealing a secret. "Soon a flood will come, and thou shalt attend to me by preparing a ship. And when the flood is risen, thou shalt enter into the ship, and I will save thee from it." The flood came, Manu hightailed it into his ship, and the fish grabbed onto the ship's anchor rope, swam over to a mountain, and tied the boat to it. In this way, Manu safely rode out the flood, and descended onto the land as soon as the waters receded. Afterwards, he sacrificed some butter and sour milk to the gods, and poof, a nice lady popped out of the waters, and they had lots of babies to populate the earth. If you're keeping track, that's 4 flood myths we've covered: Noah, Utnapishtim, Deucalion, and add Manu to the list. I wonder how many more we can find. But why mention this story if it clearly didn't happen? Well, because, see, that's where you're wrong. According to the Shatapatha Brahmana, one of the holy Vedic texts, it did happen. And that fish is really the first avatar of Vishnu, one of the 3 central deities of Hinduism. Also, Indian scholars have even figured out a date when all this happened: 3102 BC. Don't ask me to explain how they did it. But what's weird about the date is that around 3000 BC, we actually start to see evidence of the first villages to pop up around the Indus River. Coincidence? I don't know. Probably. Still, regardless, these villages would eventually grow and blossom into one of the greatest ancient societies of the world, the Harappans, more commonly known as the Indus Valley Civilization. When the ruins of their cities, located mostly in Pakistan, were found in the early 1920s, archaeologists and historians were perplexed. And when I say perplexed, I mean try to keep in mind the prevailing attitudes of the time. British India and all? No way these people could have a civilization as ancient as the Egyptians. Goodness no, dear boy. And so excuses were immediately devised. They must have been errant colonists from Mycenae, or that the brickwork of the homes was in too good shape to be ancient. Must be a modern abandoned city. You know how people are, building cities and, leaving them. But as more ruins were uncovered, specifically the great cities of Harappa and Mohenjo-Daro, each laid out in an efficient grid system of city blocks, it became obvious it was time to rewrite the history books. Here were the remains of a long-lost advanced civilization, whose name has been lost to time. Much like how Sir Arthur Evans had to pretty much speculate on most of Minoan society, including the name, so it goes for the Indus Valley civilization, who, for the rest of this episode, I'm going to refer to as the IVC, because you know me. In the early years of historians trying to understand this new addition to world history, furrowing their brows and stroking their beards, it was agreed that the original inhabitants of Harappa and Mohenjo-Daro and the other IVC cities must have gained inspiration for city building from somewhere else. Sumer was seen as a logical choice, and the people must have been impressed with the Sumerian penchant for brick houses, which they would also use, but were also grossed out by how filthy their cities were. Now, we can't prove this isn't true, but it's unlikely the IVC copied off the Sumerians, although they did have a deep interest in city planning and a special fondness for hygiene. For example, each city contains covered drainage canals which allow rainwater and sewage to wash out of the city instead of just piling up in the streets. 16 great water reservoirs were found at the city of Dolavira, 23 feet deep and 260 feet long. Toilets and baths are found in almost every house with a drain running out back, and most famous of all, a massive public bath at Mohenjo-Daro, 40 feet wide and about 8 feet deep. And here's the kicker. Even though about 370 miles separate Harappa and Mohenjo-Daro, there's a stark uniformity between the two sites that can't be ignored. We're definitely talking about a unified civilization intentionally building cities, not ones that sprout up because it seemed like a good idea to settle down. Their genius in city management was only one part of their society. They had all the hallmarks of a thriving economy. Specialized tools of copper, bronze, stone, and chert, which is a type of flint. Jewelry of gold, silver, carnelian, and agate. An elaborate and extensive pottery industry producing uniform works. Sculptures whose meaning we can only guess at. Priest kings, dancers, and toys, actual little toys. Tiny little oxen and animals and little wheeled carts. They also made a fortune selling cotton cloth, and while they might not have been influenced or inspired by the Sumerians, the two were definitely business partners. Our old pal Sargon the Great even knew of them. To the Akkadians, this land was called Meluha, and the IVC acquired their silver and copper from Sumerian merchants. We know they had contact with each other because Harappan seals appear at Sumerian digs. These square blocks are made normally of soapstone and would be pressed into clay as a merchant's personal guarantee. They all follow a similar design pattern. A single animal, usually a zebu or ox, but even a tiger or elephant, some kind of icon, and then an elaborate and curious script on top. And just like the Minoans, no one's figured it out. Best guess is that it's some kind of ancestor to the Dravidian languages of southern India and Sri Lanka, but that's all we know for now. And see, now we run into our problems for this episode. Even though we're looking at almost 1,000 years of civilization along the Indus River, there's no recorded history to go off of. I mean, I'm making assumptions here that there even was a unified civilization. Nobody knows for sure, and the story keeps changing as more is uncovered. Stinks, right? But what I can tell you is that starting around 1800 BC, even without the written word, the cities of the Indus Valley speak to us, and what they say isn't good. The climate in this normally hot and fertile region began to cool and became drier. And then in the 1700s, the cities of the Indus Valley civilization are abandoned, just like that. Hoards of jewelry and tools are left behind, items so valuable that whoever those belonged to, something really bad must have happened to warrant just leaving them there. Some ideas about why this event happened are resource exhaustion, in that the trees needed to fire the ovens to make bricks had all been cut down, or the drier climate meant the river hadn't flooded in a while, depriving the land of the precious alluvial soil at the bottom, or that the people had diverted too much of the river for irrigation and it dried up. It could even be that the soil was ruined from poor agricultural practices. We just don't know. Yet there is also a gruesome side to this mystery. In both cities, unburied skeletons lay in the streets. The bodies of women and children huddled together, some even with split skulls where a weapon came crashing down on their heads. Stories passed down through the ages speak of a people whose bloodthirsty god reveled in the destruction of these places. And so it became apparent to early Harappan historians that this civilization ended the way so many have throughout time, at the hands of barbarian invaders. "Yeah, but hold on a second," said the American archaeologist George F. Dales. "If these cities were conquered by barbarians, why are they in such good shape?" Or in his words, "There is no destruction level covering the latest period of Mohenjo-Daro, no sign of extensive burning, no bodies of warriors clad in armor and surrounded by weapons of war, and the citadel, the only fortified part of the city, yielded no evidence of a final defense." That makes sense, right? And it turns out some of the skeletons aren't even from this time period. They're from a later time when these cities went through a so-called squatter phase, when transient populations used the ruins as a base. So again, what happened? Nobody knows for sure. Most likely climate change, as a cooler world meant receding shorelines and a drier climate meant difficulty growing food. But if you think one mystery is bad enough, oh, we are far from finished. These invaders we just mentioned, make no mistake, they are real, and they've just entered India. Or rather, they've been here already, possibly for 1,000 years actually. Maybe. Are you frustrated yet? At any rate, around 1500 BC, they really start to become more known throughout the subcontinent, bringing with them a curious social system, a pantheon of gods, a love of bovine creatures, and a writing system. Finally! We know more about them than the Harappans, yet in many ways they are more mysterious and far more controversial. How so, you ask? Well, check out the next episode as we enter the Vedic Age and discuss the Aryans on the podcast history of our world.